By the time the fall session of law school began, my father's condition had worsened to the point that he could not walk, and he had to be shifted to the main part of the hospital because he could no longer communicate. It was impossible to gauge the frequency or duration of the small strokes, and Mother had warned me before my first visit to his new quarters that I should be prepared for the worst. There was little resemblance to the man who had once been so widely regarded as a tower of strength. He had lost a lot of weight since my last visit several weeks earlier. He now wore a metal brace on his left arm, and he was blind. The only stimulus that he responded to was the feel of the feeding spoon against his lips. On the morning of October 11th, 1971, 3 years to the day after I was wounded in Vietnam, I received a phone call from my mother saying that Father had developed pneumonia and had been transferred to the intensive care unit of the hospital. He was not responding to treatment, and the doctors expected the worst. I drove to the hospital as soon as I got off the phone, and my sisters and my mother joined me later in the morning. His doctor took me aside and told me that he was dying, but that it would probably be at least nightfall before the pneumonia had run its course. Mother was distraught and tried to hold herself together by talking nonstop about any topic that entered her mind as long as it did not relate to her husband. My sisters were far better able to console her than I. And at their urging, I drove back to Williamsburg in the afternoon to shave and shower and have Toddy make arrangements for standby babysitting for Loopy and Maggie. When I returned to the hospital in the late afternoon, Father's breathing was again becoming labored despite the oxygen mask, and my mother, sisters, and I sat in a small room together and waited as darkness began to fall. After what seemed like an eternity, Father's doctor came in to say heroic measures were now pointless. And Mother, sensing the doctor's next request, told my sisters that she wanted to be taken home. I sat in the hallway outside the ICU with the doctor while my mother and sisters went to my father's bedside to say their last goodbyes. Their visit was brief, and when my mother emerged, balled up, handkerchief in hand, she was supported on either side by Martha and Virginia. Choking back tears, she came over to me, brushed my cheek with her lips, and without saying a word, turned to leave the hospital. Father's doctor saw them to their car, and while he was gone, I sat smoking a cigarette and wondered how my mother was going to get by without her husband. When the doctor returned, he asked me for permission to remove my father's oxygen mask. I nodded my assent and continued to sit by myself in my wheelchair in the hall. My father was dying in the next room, and other than being glad that I was going to be alone with him when he passed away, I felt numb and emotionless. After a few more minutes, the doctor came out of the unit and beckoned me to go to my father's side. When I wheeled up to his bedside and locked the brakes on my chair, he looked frail and delicate in the dim light and deepening shadows around him. And holding his unresponsive hand, I saw that his reservoir of strength, once seemingly inexhaustible, was now almost used up. At the other end of the room, 2 nurses busied themselves with a logbook, and feeling that they had no business sharing this last moment of intimacy with us, I fought back an impulse to scream at them to get out of the room and leave us alone. Instead, I reached up and pulled the curtain around my father's bed as far forward as I could reach. After several more minutes, he struggled to take a few shallow breaths. His chest rattled through one last exhalation, and he was still. As I watched, a single tear formed in the corner of his right eye and trickled slowly down his cheek. Although I knew it was involuntary, I saw the tear as his parting gift to his only son. And I laid my head on my dead father's chest and wept for a lifetime of missed opportunities to get to know him more fully. And that's Chesty Puller.